I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. I am Dr. Jordan Robertson. I'm a naturopathic doctor in Ontario in Canada. Today, I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Melanie Sutherland. Melanie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Jordan, thank you so much. I've been looking forward to this conversation all week. Honestly, it's been a highlight. I'm so excited to be here.
So Melanie is a physiotherapist. She owns a physiotherapy clinic called Body Co in Toronto. You focus mostly on pelvic floor physio. Is that right, Melanie?
Yeah, it's been a little bit of an evolution. We really aim to help busy families simplify and optimize their health. But truthfully, when we talk about busy families, we know that women tend to be the health custodians of those busy families. And by default from that, we do have a really strong women's health component.
Right. So for me to even say that it's pelvic floor physio, that is just like the tip of the iceberg and I would love for you to walk us through sort of your own personal journey and process, because what you do as a woman and what you stand for in your business is so much more than pelvic floor physio. What I want us to get into and what we're going to talk about today and the focus of our episode is the impact of stress on pelvic floor. But to get us there, can you sort of tell us about your clinic and how you've got to this place in your career? Because it highlights beautifully how we are even going to tie stress and urinary incontinence together towards the end of this podcast. So can you just walk us through your journey?
For sure. And, I always say that life imitates art, or art imitates life is probably the better way to say it. So really, the clinic is truthfully a reflection of my personal journey. And we keep doing these add-ons because I'm like, oh, we need this, we need this. But if you had have asked me 10 years ago about pelvic health, I probably would have laughed at you and told you there was no way I was touching it with a 10-foot pole. The thought of actually spending a good portion of my day looking at people's genitals, no way. Like $1 million salary, no way. So actually the bulk of my career up until about 10 years ago was spent working in high performance sport. A lot of people don't know this about me, but I used to work with provincial, national, Olympic level athletes, professionals. For quite some time, I supported the CFL. I had a lot of athletes who were offensive and defensive linemen. So I'm not very big, and I spent the bulk of my time working with 350-pound, 7-foot athletes in optimizing their health and performance. But as much as I really, really loved that, when I had my own kids, I kind of became obsessively interested in women's health because I was just so in awe and amazed at what a woman's body could do. And I had two very different experiences. With my daughter, she was a high-risk pregnancy. I had an early induction, and as a result, I had a really crummy healing process. And I always say to people, it was really interesting that, at 6 weeks, we sort of shift this attention away from women and give it all to baby, and women are kind of forgot about. And for a long time, I lived with that. I was like, oh my gosh, my body feels like crap. I can't sit down. And then I was like, oh wait, I'm a physio and I should be able to figure some of this stuff out. So I started to go down the rabbit hole of women's health and just became super intrigued. And it also coincided at a time in my life where in my clinic, we were getting a lot more questions about it. We were having a lot of patients who really were interested in a referral. And as a business owner, I was referring out a lot. And that was really starting to piss me off, that we couldn't get these women better ourselves and that I was giving somebody else all the business. And I finally was starting to understand why, because I was living that journey myself. So I started to look into pelvic health, started to go down, that avenue. And what became abundantly clear to me was that this was really powerful medicine. Well, as much as I appreciated working in sport and athletics with a really motivated population, these women in this work that we were doing was literally life-changing for them. Like, to be able to fully participate in your life because you don't have to be 5 feet away from a bathroom is really important. Like, to be able to have really good relationships with your partner because you're not afraid of sex is really, really important. To not have a lifetime of back pain or period pain is really, really important. So we started to see just how vital it was that these practices were put into place. So we inevitably sort of changed course a little bit. But the beauty is, I think we still always look at things through that high performance lens. And when I compare my high level athletes to my high level women, the context might be a little bit different, but the parallels are so incredibly similar. So I opened Body Co. about 8 years ago now. It literally started with me in a room off of a gym where it looked like somebody had thrown their lunch against the wall. And it sort of grew out of organic need. We'd start to work with somebody and they'd be like, well, I need this. I'd be like, you're right. Like, I can't provide that service. And I've always been somebody who's been very okay with saying, I don't know, or I don't need help. So I'm like, okay, well, we're going to bring this profession on because they're going to make your experience that much more complete. And what it's evolved into today is a clinic with about 14, 15 different practitioners who all sort of have been brought in because at some point in the course of trying to treat these women a little bit better, I've been like, oh, geez, I really need to have a conversation with somebody who can look at your hormone profile. Oh, I guess we need an ND. Like, oh, I can see that there's inflammation in your body and we need to talk about your nutrition. We got to get a nutritionist in. And then it became like, oh, I really see that you need support in your life. Let's do this in a community medicine setting. So it has exploded into a bit of a beast. But I do think that beast was formed just by organically following the path of how can we best serve this population and their families.
That's so cool. And I'm so, as you're talking there, how old are your kids?
My kids are 7 and about to turn 4. So I opened Body Co. when my daughter was 8 months old. Because I was tired of working in corporate on somebody else's schedule. And Body Co was actually founded for my kids, which is probably why I place such a high value on family health and women's health.
Interesting, because as I'm hearing you talk about that story of, having this horrific birth recovery and that this was just coming on the scene, really, this conversation around pelvic health and pelvic physio. My kids are just a hair older than yours. And I've told this story on the podcast before. Like, I remember leaning against the wall, trying to hook my foot into my underwear after pregnancy. And this was like weeks after I had delivered my daughter, that my back pain was so significant. And it felt like at that time that there was really no one to turn to. And this is embedded in my brain, this frustrating, probably crying, trying to
Yeah.
doing the motion with my hand right now, trying to literally loop my ankle in so I didn't have to bend down. And I didn't feel like there was a resource, or it wasn't top of mind for me then, that there were resources that I could go to. And then it's really been this fast tracked, in my opinion, understanding of the relevance. And I think women are starting to know that when they're having these challenges, that there is a solution for that. Do you see that change in the public's perception of pelvic health?
What 100%. I've just to date myself a little bit here, I've been practicing for 20 years. And my very first boss was actually just starting to delve into pelvic health. And we thought, this is a crazy practice. What is she doing behind these doors with those women? Ugh, gross, right? And now what we hear is in Toronto alone, there's something like 500 pelvic health physios. And when she was doing it, there was literally 5 in Ontario. It's probably been the fastest growing area of physiotherapy. And what's cool about it is it's probably in the top researched area in terms of efficacy in physiotherapy. So it's amazing to see the public perception and awareness become so much more mainstream. It's amazing that the research is there to support it. And I think for me, what's probably the best is that women are finding their voice in it. I mean, my youngest is turning 4, and nobody talked to me. I mean, maybe they made the assumption I knew, but in my whole journey with 2 kids, nobody said to me, maybe you should proactively see a pelvic health physiotherapist. And like, that's only 4 years ago. And now we're getting women coming in being like, I'm thinking about getting pregnant. When should I come see you? So it is a major perspective shift, mindset shift. And I am very, very proud about that in our community.
Yeah, I'm definitely seeing that in the women that I work with too, where before I would say, hey, like I got this idea that I'm going to run by you, like just stick with me for a minute here. And, that was only a couple of years ago for women to now be like, oh, no, I did that. Or I've got one, or my pelvic physio sent me here. Right. Which I'm so encouraged with, right? Because it's helping to remove some of the normalization that we've put on some of these conditions that women felt like they needed to live with, right? This idea that you're going to be incontinent if you have kids, or this idea that, for some women, penetrative intercourse is just not a thing or not comfortable, or for other women, normalizing the pain of their periods. I think the idea that pelvic physio is a solution is helping shed some light on how those symptoms are not a normal experience for women.
Yeah, like my big soundbite that I always put out into the universe is that pelvic health issues are not the cost of motherhood, because I think that was for a really, really long time the assumption. And there was this horrendous stat back in the early 2000s, which was if you had pelvic incontinence at 5 months postnatally, 96% of those cases continued to exist at 5 years, which, like, that's a really horrific stat. And that's a really awful thing for us as a community to normalize, that 5 years after your baby you should be peeing your pants. So I am really glad to see that women are becoming so much more proactive about it, and that they're also becoming radically more responsible for the symptoms of motherhood, so it doesn't define how they live through motherhood.
So I want to talk about the stress piece, because I think, we women are aware that there are symptoms that maybe mean that their pelvic floor is a problem. We'll just say that. And we know some of those triggers, right? I think women may be able to identify, okay, I've, had a baby, or I'm pre-contemplating having a baby. This is pelvic floor needs to be on my radar. Or I have endometriosis and I would probably benefit from looking at this from a pelvic health perspective. But then, like, the stress conversation is one that I don't think we're having, right? So I think our public understanding of pelvic floor, they can probably circle the symptoms, they can probably circle some of the conditions. But what I really want to talk about is the impact of stress, because I think this is going to bring us up to having a conversation about just womanhood in general.
Yeah.
But when you and I were talking about having this conversation, one of the things you came back at me with was, I'd love to talk about how stress impacts pelvic floor. And to be perfectly honest, my first reaction was, it does, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, well, then obviously this is what we need to talk about. Because if this isn't something that I know a lot about, then I don't think that we're having this conversation in a bigger way. And so I want you to sort of like take it away, and let's talk about the relationship there between pelvic health and stress.
For sure. So, well, I'm very glad that we are having the conversation around prenatal and incontinence. I think the disservice that we've done is we've let that conversation overshadow so many of the other conditions that affect pelvic floor. And, we were talking before the podcast about sort of that prescription mentality of like, okay, I'll go to my pelvic physiotherapy, I'll get exercises, I'll be good. So I'm glad it's bringing those women in the door, but the really profound ones, the ones that I'm really seeing who need the most amount of help, are actually the women, and it's often our high achievers, our high performers, that have been dealing with symptoms for literally decades in some cases, because we haven't got to the root cause of it. And usually stress is at that root cause. So we typically see 2 profiles. We typically see people who are weak and are having incontinence related issues because of pelvic floor weakness. And that's what the general population is often associating with pelvic floor physiotherapy. But we have this whole side of women who actually have extremely, extremely tight pelvic floors. And what we know now, because for a while I was like, am I running a physiotherapy clinic, or am I running like a therapy office, a counseling office, because all of these people were coming in the door and we were treating the physiologic symptoms. But when we really dug in, when we really got into what the root cause of it was chronic stress. And I like to use the headache analogy with this because I think everybody can relate to the fact that when you're stressed, your shoulders get really tight, your neck gets really tight, you get these perpetual headaches. But the pelvic floor is just a muscle. And when we're in that chronic fight or flight state where we have an upregulated nervous system, it's going to affect your pelvic floor similarly to how it affects other areas of your body. So what we're seeing, and there's a very strong link in the evidence between stress, depression, and anxiety, is that women who have or exhibit chronic conditions in mental health, in stress, have perpetually tight pelvic floors. And it's a very different set of symptoms. These are the women who are still incontinent, but instead of having stress incontinence, so the type of incontinence where you sneeze and you leak a little bit, these women are having urge and frequency. It's the women who are having dyspareunia or painful sex. It's the women who have always had a painful period and just thought that that was what was dealt with them in life. It's the women who can't use menstrual products. And it's often the women who have really debilitating back and hip pain that they just, I have a bad back. And really when we examine them, they have super tight pelvic floors. The challenge is if I just looked at you out in the community, I could, list all your profile features. I could look all these things, but unless I do an internal exam, we can't identify these women. So sometimes people will give me a description. I'm like, oh, for sure they're weak. And we do an internal exam and they're actually exceptionally tight. And it shifts the whole perspective and it shifts the whole treatment for these women. But I think so many of them are missing that assessment piece. So many of them don't relate with the cardinal symptom of incontinence, that there's a whole group of women out there that we're underserving because we're 100% missing this profile.
So how does stress actually impact the pelvic floor? Like is there a physiological relationship there between, like, I think I can think sort of generally what happens
Yep.
when we're in that fight or flight stage and what that does to our muscles and our sympathetic versus parasympathetic. Is it as simple as that connection?
So generally when I talk about this with clients, I use that it's all in your head, but it's not in your head situation, right? Because it does go back to that HPA axis, right? In that parasympathetic, when we're talking about that and we're in that constant fight or flight, our stress mechanisms, and I'm sure your audience have heard this before, were really meant to outrun a tiger. They weren't ever meant to run a marathon. So normally what would happen in those stressful situations is we would divert resources towards muscle contraction because we're running to get away from that tiger. But when we have this elevated stress all the time, we're basically lowering the threshold for muscle firing. So instead of just having a short burst of muscle contraction, we're creating a tone that's there permanently, and we're creating a state of contraction in these muscles. So they're always tight, which means they're always pulling on our joints. They're always affecting our stability. They're affecting our sphincteric function, all of those things. And it's not until we down-regulate the nervous system that we can actually make a change in the muscle presentation.
And so that can partly be achieved through the exercises. And I want to come back to what you said there, like the prescriptive sort of treatment plan versus that sort of like looking at from that stress model perspective. So just to backtrack for a second, because we now have a solution, right? Like pelvic floor physio is a solution.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine that there's a little bit of that tendency for even practitioners to say, well, this is what we've got for incontinence, right? Like almost like when I say, like, sometimes patients will come to me and they'll say, well, what have you got for hot flashes?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that sentence, what have you got for this, really undermines how complex the body is. It really undermines how influential your entire life and well-being and mental health and like the environment, your circumstances, and all of those things are on your symptom. So yes, hot flashes may have this one single chemical interaction that's happening, but the trigger for that to happen could be your wine or your coffee or your stress or your low blood sugar or all of those things. But that idea of like, what have you got for X? I think probably is undermining how valuable that entire conversation is. And now that we're trying to say that stress is influencing pelvic floor, I imagine there's a little bit of conflict there in trying to teach some of your patients about that.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. So, a challenge has always been, and I think this is where there's a gap in the physiotherapy model and why the multidisciplinary model actually works so well, is I think as physios, we were taught we can affect the physical. And a lot of physios don't feel equipped to look at the whole biopsychosocial model, which means you have to be looking at all those lifestyle factors. So, okay, we've evolved a little bit from that. Now we're asking about those biopsychosocial models. But we've always been taught, like, don't talk to people about your mental health. Like, that is not your zone of genius. So I think what happens is a client comes in and we're starting to look at all those factors. But then we're like, oh, okay, you're stressed. Okay, I'm going to release your pelvic floor. But here's the problem: if we don't delve in, if we don't have a deeper discussion, if we don't give ourselves the opportunity to make informed referrals, this client isn't going to get better. I can release somebody's pelvic floor and I can give them stretches till they're blue in the face. But if I haven't addressed the root cause of that stress, if I haven't been able to understand it enough to make an appropriate referral to perhaps a naturopath or a nutritionist or a psychotherapist that can work collaboratively at giving this person the strategy to reduce their stress or have better coping mechanisms and downregulate that nervous system, I can work with this client for months and not be of any service to them. So stress is super complex. And, it's the model of how we built our business, right? It's like, ooh, somebody only got 80% better. What do we need to get them that extra 20% better? Okay, they need to see a therapist because they need to be talking about this. But I think we have, and there's been studies done on this, right? Practitioners aren't using the biopsychosocial model. I'll say that 3 times. To the point that they're making educated referrals. They tend to work in silos, and it becomes really important if we're going to treat these women to their highest potential that we be willing to refer out and say, I don't know, I need to talk to somebody else about this, to look at it. Because you're right, the coffee, the alcohol, stress isn't just stress of the world. It's the stress of what we put in our body. It's the stress of what we consume in our environment. So it's really important to have a full team that can take that and look at the complexity of it if we're ever going to solve it.
Sure, like on some level, it probably surprises some of your clients that you're even asking those questions.
So we used to send out outcome measures ahead of the appointment. And we used to send out the DAS, which is an anxiety, depression, and stress scale. We used to send out a catastrophization scale ahead of time, just so we knew if this client might be fitting into one of those. And it was really a logistic thing. We were actually taught when we were trained as pelvic therapists, if you send this out ahead of time, you don't have to waste your appointment time having them fill out these questionnaires. Well, inevitably, what would happen is women would get these and be like, why are you asking me if I'm depressed? I'm coming to you because I pee my pants. And they wouldn't fill out their questionnaires. And it already put this almost uneasiness into the client therapeutic relationship because they were like, what are you digging for? But when we started to have more informed conversations with them where we could explain where it could be a problem and then present them with the outcome measure, they were like, oh, I get it. Or we would have these conversations and something that they never thought about as potentially impacting their health. I mean, I can't tell you how many times a woman has broken down in my office being like, I never thought that me not having sex with my husband had something to do with my own physiology. But they were awkwardly saying like, why are you asking me these questions? And so we had to change our approach on that pretty quickly.
Because it may be intuitive to us. And I've definitely have faced that where like, okay, so you're here for I keep going back to hot flashes. I don't know why. Here for your hot flashes, like, tell me about your stress, right? Like, where is that at? And going through the sort of the system or approach that we have to investigate how stress is showing up for women. And it's almost like they don't necessarily always lean into those questions either, like not taking it super seriously because they have never had anyone sort of tie the lines between their stress and their hormones or their stress and anything that's showing up for them physically. So I definitely see that in my practice too. the research on women understanding that their whole body influences their health is actually pretty strong, right? And we see that in the fertility world, patients will say, oh, yeah, my whole health will influence, or a person's whole health will influence their fertility. But
Mhm.
then to take it seriously in their own life is something that I think we don't spend enough time, sort of talking with women about why we need to treat their stress, or we don't make that the forefront of their treatment plan. I'd love for you to touch on that a little bit, because you said something when we were off camera that I think was super valuable kind of quote, where you said, like, I need them to take the whole thing seriously, meaning I need them to take their whole life and whole health seriously, not just show up for their sessions. What do you mean by that?
Well, to bring it back to sort of that just very muscular metaphor, like if you pulled your hamstring, like me stretching it out twice a week isn't going to do anything for you. You need to take responsibility for the action you take at home. You need to look at the nutrition that you're putting into healing a muscle. You need to look at how you're treating it. You need to look at your rest cycle. So, I mean, I don't really see stress as being any different from that. But I think the problem with stress is we've really normalized it. We've really normalized the rushing woman syndrome, where we've taken on our father's jobs and our mother's responsibilities, and we feel like the downfall of that, or the symptoms that result, are normalized because we've created this badge of martyrdom in our society. So I agree with you. The research around women understanding their whole body impact on stress is very good. Do they take it seriously? No. And I often, I kind of laugh because women will say, okay, like what's my first step? Like we sort of establish that this is a problem. And so often one of the very first things I'll do is I'll teach breath, and people walk away kind of disappointed. Like, I just paid all this money and she taught me how to breathe. And it feels like a super non-sexy exercise prescription, right? But the truth of the matter is, you don't know how to breathe, which means your diaphragm is tight, which means it's pulling on all these other systems, which means you're not oxygenating your muscles and your bloodstream. And if we can't even breathe, how do you expect us to make major impactful like changes? So I think we have to lean into all the little things. I love to talk to women about how they can live in the cracks of life. Like, not make major changes. Don't throw the table over, but what are the small things you can do that are easy and bite-sized to integrate that actually have a really big impact? And you have to take them seriously. And I get that it's hard. It's taken a really long time for me to take them seriously in my own life when I prescribe them every single day, and it's still a work in progress. But we're never going to get to that root cause. We're never going to really alleviate this until we start to look at the whole picture, and we don't just say, oh, she told me to go meditate. That's very woo of her. Like, no, like seriously, you got to figure out something that resonates, that's going to make change.
And it's interesting because I think when you start to think about, your stress is impacting your health, right? If we say, well, what are your top stressors, right? Like the things that women pick are going to be like big things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Things that maybe can't be shifted overnight. I mean, I like your I like your table over analogy, right? Like, let's just like throw the table over on the work stress. But they're big things, right? They're things that maybe people think they can't change. And I imagine that that's maybe one of those barriers, right? When we say, okay, we want to work on your stress. And for them, they're like, they can finger point at some of the circumstances in their life that are maybe those triggers or causes of some of their deep stress that don't feel like they are shiftable, right? Well, I'm a mom.
Mm-hmm.
So there we go. That's it. I'm stressed. And what we're not doing is having that conversation of like, well, what is that? What is showing up in your life as a consequence of being that mom? Are we driving all over Hell's Half Acre to go to hockey games? Are we packing lunches when there's technically a hot lunch program that we could buy? Are we, right? Like, I think what women need maybe is those simpler strategies. But then when we present the simple strategy of, I want your groceries delivered, I want you to meditate, and I want you to have a smoothie, they go, well, that's not that exciting.
Yeah, but we got to start from somewhere.
Right. Because then
And
maybe one day you will quit your job, right? Like
right.
maybe those are the small things that if you felt well enough to write your resume, then maybe the bigger stress does go away.
And I'll go back to the idea of stress being a marathon, right? You would never go into a marathon without training for it. first you'd buy the running shoes, and then you'd decide if you could actually run around the block. And when you don't keel over dead after running around the block, you might try 2 blocks. And then maybe you get ambitious and you sign up for a 5K. And then eventually over 2 years, wow, this feels really awesome in my body. I'm going to try and challenge myself. Well, I think we have to look at every little change in that way too. Maybe the buying the running shoes is spending 2 minutes in your car before you finish your workday and walk into a busy household, and you breathe for 20 seconds. I get it. That doesn't seem like why you would book an appointment, but it is going to be the step that takes you from the 20 seconds of breathing to actually having a well-established mindfulness practice that's going to down-regulate a nervous system and allow you to go to the park with your kids because you don't have to be 5 feet away from a bathroom. And I get that's a big ball of yarn to unravel, but we have to start small, because without the foundation, you're building a house on a foundation of sand, right? You're building it on the beach. The view's pretty, but you're probably not going to get very far with it.
You are like the analogy queen. Can tell that you're like, your ability to communicate with your patients is so great, Melanie, because you've got all of these examples that I think like immediately you imagine this beautiful house that like is, going to like eventually like roll into the waves because it doesn't have a really strong foundation.
Well, I mean, it's not by accident. It's because I've said them over a million times, because I have to say them over, because if we're going to change the narrative on this, education probably needs to be the first piece of it.
So, now I have a personal question for you. Like, what
Yeah.
do you feel like you're doing well in those regards? Because I think that's one thing I don't know if we do enough as these successful entrepreneurial women is to share those sort of trade secrets, right? And I think when we look from the outside in my last Wild Collective session with my women, as we wrapped it up, I said, what was your biggest learning moment? And one of the women said, Jordan doesn't always ever shit together. And that us spending that time together actually taught her that, all of those pretty pictures don't like, there's lots of behind the scenes that goes on that is my own personal practice to try and stay well. But also there's lots of chaotic moments of, pizza delivery and all of those kinds of things. What do you feel like you do well? Like, how do you embody this in your own life?
Yeah. And it's interesting because I have been thinking about those vulnerable moments a lot lately. So, I mean, I've always been very good and consistent about movement. That's something that over the years has evolved, and probably just, it brings me joy, and it is my form of stress relief. But it's interesting. So I'm actually a cancer survivor. And probably a year and a half ago, I realized that my menstrual cycle had gone wonky. Um, I had insomnia. I had all these weird things. So the first thing that came to mind was like, oh my God, Melanie, it's back. So I went to the doctor. The doctor sent me for this biopsy and that biopsy. And take this through the lens of, I am a healthcare professional. I should know these things. Oh my God, I gained 10 pounds and I can't lose it and all this stuff. And so I spent like a year and a half going to every health professional and nobody being able to figure out what it was. And I'm like, again, use your brain. I'm like, oh, you're super stressed out because, you've built a business, you've changed a business, you've done this, you've done that, and you haven't actually done a good job of managing it. And yes, you exercise regularly, but oh my God, you ugly cry to your husband 3 times a week because you feel overwhelmed. You yelled at your kid because they left their shoe in the middle of the room. So I think the biggest change for me, and part of why I'm so passionate about this conversation, is I realized I needed to get my own shit together when it comes to just actually being kind to myself and really starting to set some boundaries. So I've shifted the way I've done business. I don't see patients one-on-one anymore because I realized I simply couldn't do it all. And it's allowed me to really start to work a drop-off to pickup day. I can actually pay attention to my kids. I leave my phone downstairs at night instead of picking it up before I do my morning meditation, because that's a great thing. Get stimulated by Instagram and email before you sit down to meditate. And I've had to struggle to find which of those practices really resonate in my own life and like really do some serious work on it. Like I tried to meditate for years and I was like, this is not for me. This girl is not a meditator. And then I read Emily Fletcher's book on Ziva meditation and be like, oh, you can have 5 million thoughts in your head. And that sort of shifted it for me. But I had to find a way to make it that busy people with lots of thoughts in their head can try this and do it. But I think just, yeah, coming to terms with the fact that I was not doing a good job of being kind to myself and managing my stress. And slowly, like I said, it's a work in progress, but it's getting there.
Well, it's super inspiring, right? Because I think that's the when I talk to like highly successful women, they all say the same thing. I'm on a path, right? They from the outside, it looks like they've arrived, but what they're really doing is just putting like one really small step in front of each other. And the first step was probably remembering how to breathe.
Yeah. And I think, more of these vulnerable conversations are important because I think they set up that, that paradigm, perhaps, that stress is acceptable. When we just keep seeing all these other high performing women's and it does look like they're really well put together, we create impossible standards for ourselves and we make stress an okay part of our day because we're trying to achieve that. And I think it is really important that we do, to your point, say, no, I struggle really badly here. Like this is really tough. And like, I'm actually teaching this Wild Collective or this community care course because I need it every bit as much as every single woman sitting in this circle.
I said that when we launched it as well. I was like, I don't know who this is for, right? I don't know if it's for you guys or if it's for me. Because I literally have benefited just as much from the women moving through that process and that program as the participants have. I would love, Melanie, if you could just kind of give us this, you're obviously super passionate. I love when you talk about the way that your business has expanded is just on the needs of the women as they came in the door was to realize that they needed this approach that actually took all aspects of their health really seriously. And I think when we refer as practitioners, it's funny, we were saying the patients don't take it seriously. Sometimes the practitioners don't take it seriously either. And they'll say, yeah, like you could talk to someone if you wanted about your stress
Yeah.
and leave it at that, right? It's that we don't close that loop. We say, we want you to talk to someone. And the next time I see you, you need to tell me that you took those action steps to book an appointment with a psychologist or psychotherapist. So even as practitioners, we maybe are not acknowledging the seriousness of how each of those circles in the Venn diagram play into how a woman actually gets better. We do like laser focus on the things that we are capable of that are in our little box. What's your take home message for women? Because what I want them to walk away with is knowing that there is a connection between their stress and pelvic floor. I love that you highlighted that there is the other kind of pelvic floor dysfunction beyond weakness, that maybe this is having some light bulbs go on for women that their urinary symptoms are related to pelvic floor, even if they haven't had a baby or if they maybe don't have some of those classic signs. But when you think about what your big purpose is for women and women's health and what your message is, what do you want to share with our audience before we sign off for the day?
So I think it all starts with education and normalizing these conversations that previously had some shame or vulnerability associated with them. Right? I think we have to change the context in which we talk about women's health and we have to encompass all aspects of it. It's great that pelvic health, we know that we need to see a pelvic health therapist after you've had a baby. But what I want is for women to feel really comfortable having them checked out. If you have back pain, if you're having a strained partner relationship because it's sexual in nature, I think we need to really normalize that. And I'm absolutely biased because I'm not afraid to have those conversations that everybody wants to know about but nobody talks about. But I think in general as a population we don't do that very, very well. So I think first and foremost, like we need the education to let women know that it's okay. And then I think if nothing else, just go get assessed. Like just go get assessed so you actually have a starting point. I think as pelvic health practitioners, we're in this really privileged position that because it's already a vulnerable experience, women do often open up to us and tell us those things. But then the message would be to the practitioners, refer responsibly. Like if you don't have a team around you, really take what those women are bringing to the table and what they've trusted you with in that conversation and really take action on it. And that's where I actually like to use some outcome measures too, because then you need to make sure you're getting them back in and reassessing. So what is the baseline? Okay, we've had this conversation about stress. Great, let's measure it, because we can't manage it if we haven't measured it to start. Based on what we're seeing in those outcome measures and taking that subjective data and bringing the two of them together, what is the best referral? Do you need some cognitive behavioral therapy? Do you need to have a hormone profile done? Do you need to see a nutritionist? Do you need to go to a sex counselor with your partner and discuss all of this? And then make sure we're following up on that with sort of 6 to 12 week intervals so we can actually show them progress. Because if we want them to believe in the small pieces, if we want them to believe that the woo is actually making a difference, we need to show them that they've made improvement too. So it's kind of threefold. It's like educating them to get through the door, taking away the shame and vulnerability of actually having an assessment, and then working together with them as a collaborative partnership and making sure that they're actually building on small successes.
It's interesting because patients will go for their physical exam annually and they hope to get back normal results. Right? We go to our physical, that's the annual check-in. If I ask women, like, when do you go for your physical? They all know which month of the year it is that they're going to go. And they go with the expectation that they're going to be told everything is fine. And yet to access other resources in healthcare, we go to an assessment with an expectation that they're going to find something wrong, meaning we don't go until something is so bad that we're like, they're going to find something for sure, right? We never go as this, let's just see, let's have a check-in. 5 years has gone by. My exercise regime has shifted. My body is changing, right? My hormones have shifted. I need to check in on this aspect of my health. And I hope to go and have them say nothing's wrong, right? It's a very different way of thinking about accessing these like subspecialties in medicine, whether it's naturopathic medicine or psychotherapy or nutrition. No one will sit down with a nutritionist if they think their diet's perfect, right?
Yeah.
And yet we like go to our physical exam every year, right? Like imagine what would happen for women if they accessed all of these, I really like Venn diagrams, these circles in their Venn diagram and got that clean bill of health every few years, right? That like things are good and nothing shifted and you've been assessed, right? I think I love that you brought up that word assessment, because that is such an important aspect of women deeply understanding their health and then taking it on this trajectory they want to go on, is understanding that baseline. So I love that you brought that up. And I thought I was just about to interrupt you.
No.
It's like I thought you would wanted to say something there.
No, you're good.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for spending time with me today. I love these conversations. I love being able to bring women in who have expertise that I don't have, that complement this same conversation we're often having, to expose our listeners and just expose more women to these ideas about their health that they can, intimately put their earbuds in and go for a walk and listen about. I think it's such an important part to me. And this is why I love the podcast so much. Thank you so much for spending time. How can we get connected with you? I know you do so much great online. You do everything to me. So how can our listeners get in touch with you and learn more about your practice and all the things that you offer?
Like I said, it's a work in progress of controlling my stress. First of all, thank you so much. I just looked at the clock. I'm like, oh my God, an hour's gone by already, which always means it's a great conversation. And I really appreciate being able to bring this information to your audience. So yes, absolutely. I think you have it for your show notes, but if women are interested in just 5 simple things that they can do today, and like when I say simple, like bite-sized things. Sorry, breathing is probably in there and probably you're going to now be disappointed. But bite-sized things that they can do today to start to improve the health of their pelvic floor in a proactive manner. We have a free guide, which is also on our link in our Instagram. You can check us out at bodycotoronto.com if you're interested in services in the clinic. And if you're interested in any of our group programming or just getting a sense of how we can help educate or get out, we do the Wild Collective like Jordan does. We have a teen program. We're just basically following Jordan's model. We do have a prenatal group as well.
You do everything.
But it's because it's so interconnected. The team model actually came because women said to us, I wish I had have had this information 25 years ago. But if you're interested in looking to any of those things, probably Instagram is the easiest place to find us. And our handle there is Body Code Toronto.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Melanie.
Thank you.
Such a treat.
Awesome. Thanks. Have a great day.
I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. It's my absolute passion to bring women quality and science-informed information about their health so that they can make empowered, good decisions about their health care. I'd like to invite you to join me in my Facebook community, Women's Health Unplugged. There we share live videos, blog posts, and behind-the-scenes information about the podcast where you can connect with me and other women who are interested in their health care. You can find us at facebook.com/groups/WH Unplugged. We'll see you there.